Welcome. Tonight, we are going to talk about Black Hawk, a name that echoes through the valleys and forests of the upper Mississippi River Valley, a name that speaks of defiance and dignity, of a people's struggle to maintain their way of life against the inexorable tide of change. Black Hawk, or Makatai Me Shekiakiak, in his native Sauk language meaning black sparrowhawk, was not merely a warrior or a leader. He was the embodiment of a culture, a people, and an era that was passing into memory even as he lived through its final chapters. The story of Black Hawk is one that unfolds across the vast canvas of early 19th century America, a time when the young United States was pushing westward with relentless determination, when Native American peoples found themselves caught between their ancient ways and the overwhelming force of American expansion. It is a story of courage and tragedy, of loyalty and loss, of a man who became a symbol of resistance while knowing, perhaps, that resistance itself was futile. But to understand Black Hawk, we must first understand the world into which he was born, the rich tapestry of Sauk culture and tradition that shaped him, and the land that his people had called home for generations beyond counting. To speak of Black Hawk is to speak of the Sauk people, and to speak of the Sauk is to speak of the great rivers and forests of what we now call the Upper Midwest. The Sauk, or Sac, were an Algonquian-speaking people whose homeland stretched across the region we now know as Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa, and Missouri. They were a people of the woodlands and the waterways, their lives intimately connected to the rhythms of the seasons, the movements of game, and the cycles of corn, beans, and squash that sustained them. The Sauk called themselves Asakiwaki, meaning people of the outlet, referring to their ancestral home at the outlet of the Saginaw River in what is now Michigan. But by the time of Black Hawk's birth, his people had long since migrated westward, settling along the Rock River in present-day Illinois, where it flows into the mighty Mississippi. Here, at a place called Saukenuk, the Sauk established one of the largest and most prosperous villages in the region, a place of longhouses and gardens, of ceremonies and councils, a place that would become the center of Black Hawk's world. Saukenuk was not merely a village, it was a universe unto itself. Stretching for miles along the Rock River, it was home to thousands of people during the warm months when the Sauk gathered together for planting and community. The village site was chosen with the wisdom of generations, situated on fertile bottomland where the soil was rich and dark, perfect for growing the crops that sustained the people. Nearby were forests filled with deer, bear, and other game, while the rivers teemed with fish. It was a land of abundance, a place where the Sauk could live well if they lived wisely, in harmony with the land and its gifts. The Sauk were not isolated. They were part of a vast network of Native American peoples who traded, allied, and sometimes fought with one another across the heartland of North America. Their closest allies were the Meskwaki, or Fox, a people so closely connected to the Sauk that they would come to be known together as the Sac and Fox. These two peoples shared not only language and culture, but also a history of cooperation and mutual support that would continue through all the trials that lay ahead. The rhythm of Sauk life followed the seasons with a pattern perfected over countless generations. In the spring, the people would return to Saukenuk from their winter hunting grounds, and the women would prepare the fields and plant the corn, beans, and squash that were the staples of their diet. The three sisters, as these crops were known, were planted together in a practice of agricultural wisdom. The corn stalks provided support for the climbing beans, while the beans added nitrogen to the soil, and the broad squash leaves shaded the ground, preventing weeds and retaining moisture. While the women tended the crops, the men hunted and fished, defended the village, and conducted the raids and warfare that were an integral part of life in this contested region. War was not merely about conquest or territory for the Sauk. It was deeply embedded in their culture, a way for young men to prove their courage and earn honor, a means of settling disputes and maintaining the balance of power among the various peoples of the region. In summer, as the crops grew tall and the days grew long, the Sauk would harvest wild plants and berries, fish the rivers, and hunt in the forests. The village would be alive with activity, children playing, women working hides and making clothes, men crafting tools and weapons, elders sharing stories and wisdom. There would be ceremonies and dances, times of celebration and thanksgiving for the gifts of the earth and the spirits that sustained all life. As autumn approached and the crops ripened, the harvest would begin in earnest. This was a time of hard work, but also of satisfaction, as the people gathered the fruits of their labor and prepared for the long winter ahead. Corn would be dried and stored, beans and squash preserved, meat smoked and packed away. And when the first frosts came and the leaves began to turn, the Sauk would leave Saukenuk and head west into what is now Iowa and Missouri, dispersing into smaller family groups for the winter hunt. The winter hunt was a time of testing, when the Sauk hunters tracked deer, elk, and bison across the snow-covered prairies and through the frozen forests. It was a time when families lived in temporary camps, when the skills of survival were honed, when the bonds between fathers and sons, between brothers and cousins, were strengthened through shared hardship and shared success. And when the ice began to break on the rivers and the first geese returned from the Chukchupitsuas south, the Sauk would make their way back to Saukenuk, back to the village by the Rock River, to begin the cycle anew. This was the world into which Black Hawk was born, a world of order and meaning, of tradition and continuity, a world that had existed in much the same form for longer than anyone could remember. It was a world that seemed eternal, as natural and unchanging as the rivers themselves. But even as Black Hawk drew his first breath, forces were already in motion that would shatter this world forever. The birth of a warrior. Black Hawk was born in the year 1767 at Saukenuk, in the heart of the Sauk homeland. The exact date is lost to history, as the Sauk did not keep written records, and the passage of time was marked not by the European calendar, but by the cycles of nature and the great events that shaped their world. But the year itself is significant, for 1767 was a time when the European powers that had long contested for control of North America were beginning to turn their attention to the vast interior of the continent. The infant who would become Black Hawk was given the name Maka Taimi Shekiakiak, Black Sparrow Hawk, a name that carried power and meaning. Among the Sauk, names were not arbitrary labels but expressions of character and destiny. The sparrow hawk, or what we now call the American kestrel, was a small but fierce bird of prey, swift and agile, feared by creatures much larger than itself. It was a fitting name for one who would grow to be a warrior, a leader, a man who would stand against impossible odds with courage and determination. Black Hawk's father, Pieza, was a respected member of the Thunder Clan, one of the several clans that made up Sauk society. The clan system was fundamental to Sauk life, determining one's place in society, one's obligations and privileges, one's very identity. A child was born into the clan of his or her father, and this membership was a bond that lasted for life, connecting each individual to a network of kin that extended across the entire Sauk nation. From his earliest years, Black Hawk was immersed in the world of the Sauk. He learned the language of his people, a language rich with metaphor and meaning, a language that expressed not just facts, but relationships, not just things, but the connections between things. He learned the stories of his people, the great narratives that explain the origins of the Sauk, their relationship with the spirit world, the proper way to live and the path to honor and respect. He learned by watching and doing, as was the Sauk way. There were no schools, no formal instruction as Europeans would understand it. Instead, children learned by observing their elders and imitating them, by helping with tasks and gradually taking on more responsibility as they grew. A Sauk child learned to walk by watching others walk, to speak by hearing others speak, to hunt by accompanying hunters, to plant by working in the fields alongside the women. Black Hawk learned to fish in the Rock River, to set snares for rabbits, to track deer through the forest. He learned to identify plants, to know which were good to eat and which could heal and which must be avoided. He learned the arts of survival, how to make fire, how to build a shelter, how to read the signs of weather in the sky and the behavior of animals. These were not lessons in the formal sense, but the accumulated wisdom of generations, passed down through example and practice. But beyond these practical skills, Black Hawk was also learning the deeper lessons of Sauk culture. He was learning about courage and honor, about loyalty to family and clan and nation. He was learning the importance of generosity, for among the Sauk, as among many Native American peoples, wealth was not measured by what one possessed, but by what one gave away. A respected man was one who shared freely, who provided for his relatives, who thought first of the welfare of the community rather than his own gain. He was learning about the spirit world that surrounded and interpenetrated the physical world. For the Sauk, the universe was alive with spiritual power, with forces and beings that had to be acknowledged, respected, and sometimes appeased. There were spirits in the rivers and forests, spirits of the animals and plants, spirits of the thunder and the wind. There were great, manitous, powerful beings who could grant visions and power to those who sought them properly. And there was the Great Spirit, Gitche Manitou, the creator and sustainer of all things, to whom the Sauk offered prayers and thanks. As Black Hawk grew from childhood into youth, he began to prepare more seriously for his future role as a warrior. Among the Sauk, as among most plains and woodlands peoples, warfare was central to male identity. A man gained status and respect through his deeds in battle, through his courage in facing enemies, through the scalps and prisoners he took, through his skill in raiding and his wisdom in council. But Sauk warfare was not the total war of European powers, not the wars of conquest and annihilation that the young United States would bring to the frontier. It was more ritualized, more personal, a way of settling disputes, of proving courage, of maintaining the balance of power and honor between peoples. Black Hawk's first opportunity to prove himself came when he was still a young man, perhaps 15 years old. The Sauk were at war with the Osage, a powerful people who lived to the south and west, in what is now Missouri and Kansas. The conflict between the Sauk and the Osage was old, rooted in competition for hunting grounds and in cycles of raid and revenge that stretched back beyond memory. For Black Hawk, joining a war party against the Osage was a rite of passage, a chance to prove that he had the courage and skill to be counted among the warriors of his people. The raid into Osage country was Black Hawk's first taste of combat, and according to his own later account, he distinguished himself with bravery. In the fighting, he killed an Osage warrior and took his first scalp, an act that marked his transition from youth to warrior, from boy to man. The scalp was not taken out of cruelty or savagery, as European observers often believed, but as a symbol of victory, a tangible proof of courage in battle. Black Hawk returned to Saukenuk a warrior, entitled now to participate in the war dances, to speak in councils of war, to be counted among the defenders of his people. But if that first raid was a moment of triumph, it was also the beginning of a lifelong pattern. Black Hawk would spend much of his life at war, fighting not only the Osage but also the Cherokee to the south, and eventually, fatefully, the Americans. Warfare was not continuous. There were long periods of peace, times of hunting and planting and raising families. But the possibility of war was always present, and for a man like Black Hawk, whose courage and skill brought him respect and status, the call to battle was hard to resist. The young warrior's path. As Black Hawk entered his prime, he became known as one of the most skilled and courageous warriors of the Sauk Nation. Raid followed raid, battle followed battle, and with each engagement, Black Hawk's reputation grew. He was not only brave, but also cunning, able to plan raids and lead war parties with skill and judgment. He understood the tactics of woodland warfare, the importance of surprise, the value of good intelligence, the need for careful planning combined with decisive action. The Sauk were formidable warriors, respected and feared by their enemies. They were skilled with the bow and arrow, accurate and deadly at ranges that would have seemed impossible to European observers. They could move through the forest with stealth and silence, appearing as if from nowhere to strike, and then melting back into the wilderness before an enemy could respond. They were also adept at the psychological aspects of warfare, using war cries and intimidation, taking scalps and prisoners not just for practical reasons, but to demoralize their enemies and inspire their own warriors. But Black Hawk was learning more than just the arts of war. He was also learning about leadership, about how to earn the respect and loyalty of other warriors, about how to balance courage with wisdom, aggression with caution. Among the Sauk, leadership was not hereditary in the European sense. A man might come from a prominent family, and this would certainly help him. But ultimately, leaders were those who earned respect through their deeds and their character. No one could simply claim to be a chief. One had to be acknowledged as such by others, and this acknowledgement had to be continually renewed through continued service to the people. Black Hawk married and started a family, taking a wife whose name has not been preserved in the historical record, but who would be his companion through all the trials ahead. They had children together, and Black Hawk took on the responsibilities of a husband and father, providing for his family through hunting and warfare, teaching his sons the skills and values of Sauk culture, ensuring that the traditions of his people would continue into the next generation. Life at Saukenuk during these years was good. The village thrived, the crops were abundant, and the hunting was plentiful. The Sauk maintained their alliances with the Fox and other neighboring peoples, and while there were always tensions and occasional conflicts, the overall situation was relatively stable. The European presence in the region was still limited, confined mostly to French traders who had been coming to the upper Mississippi Valley for generations, exchanging manufactured goods for furs and generally maintaining peaceful relations with the native peoples. The French traders were different from the American settlers who would come later. They were interested in commerce, not in land. They learned native languages, married native women, and adapted themselves to native ways as much as the natives adapted to them. The French presence brought changes, certainly. European goods became incorporated into native life. Metal tools and weapons, glass beads and cloth, guns and ammunition. These goods were useful, even transformative, but they did not fundamentally threaten the Sauk way of life. The Sauk could trade furs for European goods, and still live as they always had, still plant their corn and hunt their game, still govern themselves according to their own customs and traditions. But even during these relatively peaceful years, there were signs of change on the horizon. To the east, beyond the Great Lakes, the British and their American colonists were locked in a struggle that would reshape the continent. The American Revolution was a distant thunder to the Sauk, but its reverberations would eventually reach even to Saukenuk. And when the revolution ended in American victory and independence, the Sauk found themselves in a new and uncertain world. The Treaty of Paris in 1783, which officially ended the Revolutionary War, had profound implications for native peoples throughout the region. The British ceded to the new United States all the territory south of the Great Lakes and east of the Mississippi River, a vast domain that included the traditional homelands of dozens of native nations. The fact that the British and Americans negotiated this treaty without any consultation with the native peoples themselves, without any recognition of their sovereignty or their rights to the land, was an ominous sign of what was to come. For the Sauk, the immediate impact of American independence was limited. They were still far from the centers of American settlement, still able to maintain their traditional way of life with relatively little interference. But they were increasingly drawn into the conflicts between the British, who still controlled Canada and maintained considerable influence among the native peoples of the region, and the Americans, who were expanding westward with growing confidence and determination. Black Hawk, like many Sauk warriors, was drawn into these conflicts. The Sauk had long-standing ties to the British, who had replaced the French as the dominant European power in the region after the French and Indian War. The British had cultivated these ties carefully, providing gifts and trade goods, offering military support against the Sauk's enemies, and generally treating the native peoples as valuable allies rather than obstacles to be removed. When tensions between Britain and the United States erupted into open warfare in the War of 1812, it was natural that many Sauk warriors, including Black Hawk, would side with the British. The War of 1812 and its aftermath. The War of 1812 was, in many ways, a continuation of the American Revolution, a final settling of accounts between Britain and the United States. For the native peoples caught between these two powers, the war was both an opportunity and a danger. It was an opportunity to check American expansion, to form alliances that might preserve native sovereignty and native lands. But it was also a danger, for defeat would leave the native peoples at the mercy of a victorious United States with no European power to balance American ambitions. Black Hawk threw himself into the war with characteristic energy and courage. He led war parties in support of British forces, raiding American settlements and supply lines, fighting in several significant engagements. One of his most notable actions came at the Battle of Campbell's Island in 1814, where Sauk and Fox warriors, along with their Kickapoo and Winnebago allies, ambushed an American supply boat on the Mississippi River. The ambush was successful, inflicting casualties and capturing supplies, a small victory, but one that demonstrated the continued ability of native warriors to resist American encroachment. Black Hawk also participated in the defense of Prairie du Chien, a strategic trading post on the Mississippi where American forces had established a presence. The Sauk and their allies, supported by British troops, besieged the American garrison and eventually forced its surrender. These were heady times for Black Hawk and his fellow warriors. Fighting alongside the British, they could believe that they were part of a larger effort to push back the Americans, to preserve the native world that was threatened by American expansion. But the war did not go as Black Hawk and other native leaders had hoped. The British were not truly committed to defending native interests. They were focused on their own strategic objectives. And when it became clear that a decisive victory over the United States was unlikely, they were willing to negotiate. The Treaty of Ghent, signed in December 1814, ended the War of 1812 and essentially restored the status quo ante bellum. The British gained nothing and lost nothing. But for the native peoples who had fought alongside them, the treaty was a disaster. The Treaty of Ghent made no provision for native rights or native lands. The British, having used native warriors to fight the Americans, now abandoned them to negotiate their own peace with the United States. This abandonment was a bitter blow to leaders like Black Hawk, who had trusted in the British alliance, who had believed that the British would honor their commitments to their native allies. The realization that the Europeans would sacrifice native interests for their own convenience was a lesson that Black Hawk would never forget. In the aftermath of the war, the United States moved quickly to consolidate its position in the Northwest Territory. American forces built forts, established trading posts, and began the systematic process of acquiring native lands through treaties. These treaties were often coerced, negotiated with leaders who did not represent their people, and violated as soon as it was convenient for the Americans. But they provided a veneer of legality to the American expansion, a pretense that the land was being acquired through agreement rather than conquest. One such treaty had been signed in 1804, long before the War of 1812, but it would come to haunt the Sauk for decades. The Treaty of 1804 was negotiated in St. Louis between William Henry Harrison, the governor of the Indiana Territory, and a small group of Sauk and Fox leaders who had come to St. Louis to resolve a dispute over the killing of some American settlers. Harrison took advantage of the situation to pressure these leaders into signing a treaty that ceded to the United States all Sauk and Fox lands east of the Mississippi River, including Saukenuk itself, in exchange for annual payments and the promise that the Sauk could continue to live on the land until it was sold to settlers. The treaty was fraudulent from the start. The leaders who signed it had no authority to cede such vast territories. Among the Sauk, land was not owned by individuals or even by chiefs. It belonged to the people collectively, and such a momentous decision would have required the consent of the entire nation. Moreover, the Sauk leaders who signed the treaty were reportedly drunk at the time, and they may not have fully understood what they were agreeing to. Black Hawk and other Sauk leaders rejected the treaty, arguing that it was invalid and that the Sauk had never legitimately ceded their lands. But the United States government recognized the treaty as valid, and as American settlers began to push into the region after the War of 1812, they pointed to the Treaty of 1804 as legal justification for claiming Sauk lands. The stage was being set for a confrontation, a clash between the Sauk's determination to hold on to their homeland and the Americans' determination to take it. The gathering storm. The years following the War of 1812 were years of increasing tension between the Sauk and the Americans. American settlers were moving into the region in growing numbers, drawn by the promise of cheap, fertile land. They established farms and towns, built roads and mills, and began to transform the landscape in ways that were fundamentally incompatible with the Sauk way of life. Where the Sauk saw hunting grounds and wild game, the Americans saw wasted land that needed to be cleared and cultivated. Where the Sauk saw rivers teeming with fish, the Americans saw power for mills and navigation for commerce. The two cultures were on a collision course, and Black Hawk could see it coming. He watched as American settlers encroached on Sauk lands, as they fenced fields and cut forests, as they drove away the game and disrupted the seasonal cycles that had sustained his people for generations. He watched as American whiskey flowed into Sauk villages, destroying families and breaking down the social order. He watched as American treaty commissioners pressed Sauk leaders to sign away more land, always more land, with promises that were made one day and broken the next. The Sauk nation was divided in its response to these pressures. Some, led by a chief named Keokuk, argued for accommodation with the Americans. Keokuk recognized the overwhelming power of the United States and believed that the only way for the Sauk to survive was to accept the inevitable, to cede the lands the Americans demanded and move west across the Mississippi where they might live in peace. Keokuk was a skilled orator and a practical man, and his arguments carried weight with many Sauk people who were weary of conflict and fearful of American retaliation. But Black Hawk rejected this path of accommodation. He was a traditionalist, deeply committed to preserving the Sauk way of life and the lands that sustained it. Saukenuk was not just a village to Black Hawk. It was the center of his universe, the place where his ancestors were buried, where his children had been born, where the sacred rituals of his people had been performed for generations. To abandon Saukenuk would be to abandon everything that made the Sauk who they were. It would be a surrender not just of land, but of identity, of dignity, of the very essence of what it meant to be Sauk. Black Hawk became the leader of the opposition to American demands, the voice of those Sauk who would not accept the loss of their homeland. He argued that the Treaty of 1804 was invalid, that the Sauk had never legitimately ceded their lands, and that they had every right to remain at Saukenuk. He called on the Sauk to resist American encroachment, to defend their lands and their way of life. And he looked for allies, reaching out to other native nations who were facing similar pressures, hoping to build a coalition that could stand against American expansion. One of the figures who inspired Black Hawk during this period was Tecumseh, the great Shawnee leader who had tried to unite the native peoples of the region into a confederation to resist American expansion. Tecumseh had visited Saukenuk in 1810, and his message of native unity and resistance had made a profound impression on Black Hawk. Tecumseh argued that the land belonged to all native peoples collectively, that no single tribe or individual had the right to sell it without the consent of all. He called for native peoples to abandon the ways of the whites, to return to their traditional customs, to stand together against the Americans. Tecumseh had been killed at the Battle of the Thames during the War of 1812, fighting alongside the British against the Americans. His confederacy had not survived his death, fragmenting as different native nations made their own accommodations with the victorious Americans. But Tecumseh's vision of native unity and resistance continued to inspire leaders like Black Hawk, who saw in Tecumseh's struggle a model for their own resistance. Black Hawk also found inspiration in the teachings of the Shawnee prophet, Tecumseh's brother Tenskwatawa, who preached a spiritual revival among native peoples. The prophet called on Native Americans to reject European goods and ways, to return to traditional practices, to purify themselves and renew their connection to the spirit world. This message resonated with Black Hawk, who saw the corrupting influence of American civilization on his people and longed for a return to the old ways, to a time when the Sauk lived in harmony with the land and with the spirits. But despite his determination and his eloquence, Black Hawk found it increasingly difficult to rally the Sauk behind his vision of resistance. The division between Black Hawk's band and Keokuk's accommodationist faction grew deeper, splitting the Sauk nation into two camps. Keokuk had the support of American officials, who recognized him as the principal chief of the Sauk and directed their gifts and their attention to him. Black Hawk, meanwhile, was increasingly seen by the Americans as a troublemaker, an obstacle to the peaceful acquisition of Sauk lands. The situation came to a head in the late 1820s. American settlers were moving into the Rock River Valley in increasing numbers, and they were not waiting for the Sauk to voluntarily leave Saukenuk. Settlers were squatting on Sauk lands, destroying Sauk fields, even moving into Sauk lodges when the people were away on their winter hunts. When the Sauk returned to Saukenuk in the spring, they would find their homes occupied, their fields fenced and plowed by settlers who claimed ownership of the land by right of the Treaty of 1804. Black Hawk and his followers protested to American officials, but their complaints were ignored or dismissed. The Americans insisted that the Treaty of 1804 was valid, that the Sauk had ceded their lands, and that they must now move west of the Mississippi. In 1829, American officials delivered an ultimatum. The Sauk must abandon Saukenuk by the Itzig spring of 1830 or face forcible removal. Black Hawk refused. He argued that the Sauk had never sold Saukenuk, that the treaty was a fraud, that his people had every right to remain in their homeland. He called on the Sauk to stand firm, to resist American demands, to defend their homes and their heritage. But he also knew that open warfare with the Americans would be suicidal. The Sauk were vastly outnumbered, and the Americans had resources and military power that the Sauk could never match. Black Hawk needed allies, needed support, needed some way to strengthen the Sauk's position before confronting the Americans. In the spring of 1830, when the deadline for the Sauk's removal arrived, Black Hawk led his band back to Saukenuk, as they had always done. They planted their crops, settled into their lodges, and tried to resume their normal lives. But the situation was tense. American settlers were angry at the Sauk's refusal to leave. American officials were demanding that the Sauk be removed, by force if necessary. And Black Hawk and his followers were preparing themselves for the confrontation they knew was coming. General Edmund Gaines, the commander of American forces in the region, was ordered to remove the Sauk from Saukenuk. In June 1831, Gaines arrived with a force of regular Army troops and Illinois militia. He met with Black Hawk and other Sauk leaders and demanded that they leave immediately and move west of the Mississippi. Black Hawk was defiant, arguing that the Sauk had done nothing wrong, that they were simply living in their own homes on their own land. But he also understood the reality of the situation. The American force was too strong to resist. If the Sauk fought, they would be destroyed. Faced with overwhelming military force, Black Hawk reluctantly agreed to leave. On June 26, 1831, Black Hawk and his band crossed the Mississippi River, leaving Saukenuk behind. It was a bitter moment, a moment of defeat and humiliation. Black Hawk had devoted his life to defending his people and their homeland, and now he was forced to abandon everything he had fought for. As he looked back at Saukenuk from the western bank of the Mississippi, he knew that he was leaving not just a village but a world, a way of life that could never be fully recovered. But Black Hawk had not given up. As his band settled into their new camps in Iowa, he began to plan. He still believed that the Sauk could return to Saukenuk, that the Treaty of 1804 could be challenged, that the Americans could be persuaded or compelled to recognize Sauk rights. He reached out to other native nations, seeking support for a return to Illinois. He sent messages to the British in Canada, hoping that they might provide assistance. And he talked to a man named Wabokishiek, known to the Americans as White Cloud or the Winnebago Prophet. Wabokishiek was a mixed-blood Winnebago and Sauk who had considerable influence among the Winnebagos and other native peoples of the region. He was a spiritual leader, a medicine man who claimed to have visions and powers, and he encouraged Black Hawk to believe that the British would support a Sauk return to Illinois, that other native nations would join the Sauk in resisting the Americans, and that the spirits favored the Sauk cause. Whether Wabokishiek genuinely believed these things or was simply telling Black Hawk what he wanted to hear is unclear. But his words fed Black Hawk's determination to return to Saukenuk. The Black Hawk War, a tragic miscalculation. As winter turned to spring in 1832, Black Hawk made his fateful decision. He would lead his band back across the Mississippi, back to Saukenuk and the Rock River Valley. It was not, in Black Hawk's mind, an act of war. He believed that he could return peacefully, that he could plant crops and live as his people had always lived. He believed that the British would provide support, that the Winnebagos and Potawatomis would join him, that the Americans would be forced to negotiate rather than fight. It was a terrible miscalculation, born of desperation and fed by false promises. The British had no intention of supporting Black Hawk. They had made their peace with the Americans and wanted no more conflicts on the frontier. Most Winnebagos and Potawatomis had no desire to join what they saw as a hopeless cause, and the Americans had no intention of negotiating. They saw Black Hawk's return as an invasion, an act of war that must be met with overwhelming force. On April 5, 1832, Black Hawk led his band across the Mississippi River into Illinois. With him were about 1,000 people, including some 500 warriors and their families. It was a large group, but not an army prepared for war. They brought women and children, elderly and young, all the people of Black Hawk's band who refused to abandon their leader and their hope of returning home. As news of Black Hawk's crossing spread, panic erupted throughout Illinois and the surrounding territories. American settlers fled their farms, fearing a general native uprising. Illinois Governor John Reynolds called out the state militia, and the federal government dispatched regular army troops under General Henry Atkinson. Within weeks, an American force of over 1,000 men, militia and regulars combined, was mobilizing to pursue Black Hawk and his band. Black Hawk quickly realized that he had made a terrible mistake. The British support he had counted on did not materialize. The Winnebagos and Potawatomis, while sympathetic, were unwilling to risk American retaliation by openly joining the Sauk. American forces were mobilizing much faster than he had expected, and it was clear that they intended to destroy his band, not negotiate with it. Black Hawk tried to turn back, to recross the Mississippi and avoid the catastrophe he saw approaching, but events were already spiraling out of control. On May 14, 1832, a detachment of Illinois militia under Major Isaiah Stillman encountered Black Hawk and a small party of Sauk warriors north of the Rock River. Black Hawk, hoping to avoid bloodshed, sent 3 warriors under a white flag to parley with the Americans. But the militiamen, undisciplined and nervous, opened fire on the emissaries. In the chaos that followed, Black Hawk and his warriors counterattacked, routing the militia force in what became known as the Battle of Stillman's Run. It was a victory for Black Hawk, but a hollow one. He had hoped to avoid war, but now war had found him. The death of the emissaries under a flag of truce was a violation of the most basic rules of warfare, and it enraged Black Hawk and his warriors. But more importantly, the battle made it clear that there would be no peaceful resolution, no negotiation, no chance for Black Hawk's band to return to Saukenuk. The only questions now were how long they could survive, and at what cost. The Americans, stung by their defeat at Stillman's Run, were now fully mobilized and determined to destroy Black Hawk's band. General Atkinson led a force of over 2,000 men in pursuit of the Sauk, while other American forces scoured the countryside, attacking any native people they encountered, whether they were associated with Black Hawk or not. It was the beginning of a campaign of terror and violence that would traumatize the region for months to come. Black Hawk, realizing the hopelessness of his situation, now focused on saving his people. He led them north into the swamps and forests of northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin, trying to stay ahead of the pursuing American forces while also seeking food and support from the Winnebagos and other native peoples. But the Winnebagos, fearing American retaliation, provided little help. Food was scarce, and Black Hawk's people were suffering. The warriors had to constantly screen the band from American pursuit, fighting delaying actions to allow the women, children, and elderly to keep moving. The pursuit was relentless. American forces, augmented by Menominee, Dakota, and other native allies who saw an opportunity to strike at their traditional Sauk enemies, tracked Black Hawk's band through the wilderness. There were several skirmishes and battles as the Sauk desperately tried to evade capture or annihilation. At the Battle of Wisconsin Heights on July 21, 1832, Black Hawk and his warriors fought a brilliant delaying action, holding off the American pursuers long enough for most of the band to cross the Wisconsin River and continue their flight westward. But the Sauk were exhausted, starving, and demoralized. Many warriors had been killed in the fighting, and those who remained were short of ammunition and supplies. The women and children were struggling to keep up, worn down by weeks of constant flight and privation. Black Hawk knew that they could not continue much longer. The only hope now was to reach the Mississippi River and cross back into Iowa, hoping to find safety among the Sauk and Fox communities west of the river. On August 1, 1832, Black Hawk's band reached the Mississippi River at a place called Bad Axe, near the present-day town of Victory, Wisconsin. They hoped to cross the river quickly, to escape the pursuing Americans and find refuge on the western bank. But their luck had run out. An American steamboat, the Warrior, was patrolling the river, and it arrived at Bad Axe just as the Sauk were attempting to cross. Black Hawk tried to surrender, raising a white flag and calling out to the Americans on the steamboat. But the Americans, whether they misunderstood Black Hawk's intentions or simply didn't care, opened fire with the steamboat's cannon and small arms. The Sauk on the riverbank were caught in the open, exposed to the devastating fire from the steamboat. Dozens were killed or wounded in the first minutes of the attack. Before the Sauk could recover, the main American force under General Atkinson arrived. On August 2, 1832, the Americans launched a full assault on the Sauk position at Bad Axe. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. The Sauk warriors, outnumbered and outgunned, fought desperately to protect their families, but they were overwhelmed. American soldiers and militia, along with their Menominee and Dakota allies, swept through the Sauk camp, killing anyone they encountered. Men, women, and children were shot down as they tried to flee or fought back or simply huddled together in terror. Some Sauk managed to reach the river and attempted to swim across to safety, but the Warrior returned and opened fire on the swimmers, killing them in the water. Dakota warriors on the western bank of the river, allies of the Americans, waited for those who managed to reach the Iowa shore, killing many more. It was a scene of utter carnage, a one-sided slaughter that shocked even some of the American participants. When the killing finally stopped, at least 150 Sauk lay dead at Bad Axe, and probably many more. The exact number will never be known, as many bodies were swept away by the river or were never found. The survivors, mostly women and children, who had managed to hide or flee during the attack, were taken prisoner by the Americans. Black Hawk himself was not at Bad Axe. He had left the main band earlier, hoping to find help from the Winnebagos, and thus escaped the massacre. The Battle of Bad Axe was the end of the Black Hawk War, though not quite the end of Black Hawk's story. For the Sauk, it was a catastrophe, the destruction of Black Hawk's band and the shattering of any hope that they might resist American expansion. For the Americans, it was a victory, but one so brutal and one-sided that it troubled the consciences of some who participated in it. Even some American officers expressed unease at what had happened at Bad Axe, acknowledging that it was more a massacre than a battle. Captivity, surrender, and reflection. Black Hawk remained at large for several weeks after the Ouachita massacre at Bad Axe, moving through Wisconsin with a small group of followers, still hoping to find safety or support. But there was nowhere left to go. The Winnebagos, pressured by the Americans and fearing retaliation if they harbored the fugitive Sauk leader, eventually betrayed Black Hawk. On August 27, 1832, Black Hawk and the Winnebago prophet Wabokiechiek surrendered to a Winnebago band, who promptly turned them over to American authorities. Black Hawk was taken in chains to Jefferson Barracks near St. Louis, the same place where the fraudulent Treaty of 1804 had been signed nearly 3 decades earlier. It must have been a bitter irony for the old warrior to find himself imprisoned in the very place where, in his view, the chain of events that led to his people's destruction had begun. He was held there through the fall and winter of 1832-1833, a prisoner of the United States government, uncertain of his fate. But Black Hawk would not be executed or permanently imprisoned. The American government, perhaps recognizing that making a martyr of the famous Sauk leader would be counterproductive, decided instead to use him as an object lesson. In the spring of 1833, Black Hawk and several other Sauk prisoners were taken on a tour of the eastern United States. They were paraded through cities and towns, exhibited to curious Americans who wanted to see the famous Indian warrior who had dared to defy the United States. The tour took Black Hawk to major cities including St. Louis, Louisville, Cincinnati, and Washington, D.C. Crowds gathered wherever he went, and newspapers reported on his appearances. For many Americans, it was their first glimpse of a Native American, and they were fascinated by Black Hawk's dignity and bearing. Despite his status as a prisoner, Black Hawk conducted himself with pride and composure, impressing many who saw him. In Washington, Black Hawk met with President Andrew Jackson, the architect of Indian removal policy. It was a meeting between two old warriors, though they stood on opposite sides of history. Jackson, who had made his reputation fighting Native Americans and who was now presiding over their systematic removal from their eastern homelands, might have expected Black Hawk to be humbled and defeated. But Black Hawk maintained his dignity, and while he acknowledged that he had been defeated, he did not apologize for defending his people and their homeland. The tour had its intended effect. Americans who saw Black Hawk were reminded of the power and reach of their government, of its ability to defeat and capture even the most determined native resistance. But the tour also humanized Black Hawk in the eyes of many Americans. They saw not a savage or a monster, but a man of courage and principle who had fought for his people and his home. Sympathy for Black Hawk began to grow, even as Americans continued to support the policies that had led to his defeat. After the tour, Black Hawk was released and allowed to return to Iowa, to the Sauk and Fox communities west of the Mississippi. But he was not allowed to return as a leader. American authorities recognized Keokuk as the principal chief of the Sauk, and Black Hawk was required to acknowledge Keokuk's authority. It was a final humiliation for Black Hawk to be subordinated to the man who had advocated accommodation with the Americans, the man whose policies Black Hawk had opposed for so long. Black Hawk settled on the Iowa River, living with a small group of followers in a village near Keokuk's main settlement. He was an old man now, in his late 60s, and his fighting days were over. But he was not forgotten. Visitors came to see him, curious about the famous warrior, and Black Hawk received them with courtesy and dignity. He talked about the old days, about the wars he had fought, about Saukenuk and the life his people had lived there, and he dictated his autobiography to an interpreter, a document that would become one of the most important first-hand accounts of Native American life and the conflicts with American expansion. Black Hawk's autobiography, published in 1833 as Life of Makatai Meshekiakiak, or Black Hawk, was a remarkable document. In it, Black Hawk told his own story in his own words, describing his life as a warrior, his love for his people and their homeland, his reasons for resisting American demands, and his ultimate defeat. The autobiography was widely read and went through multiple editions, giving Americans a native perspective on the conflicts that were reshaping the continent. In his autobiography, Black Hawk was frank about his mistakes and the suffering of his people, but he was also unapologetic about his core beliefs. He maintained that the Treaty of 1804 was fraudulent, that the Sauk had never legitimately ceded Saukenuk, and that he had been justified in trying to return to his homeland. He expressed regret for the suffering the war had caused, but not for the attempt itself. Even in defeat, Black Hawk refused to accept that the Americans had been right to take Sauk lands. The autobiography also revealed Black Hawk's deep love for Saukenuk and the life his people had lived there. His descriptions of the village and the surrounding country are filled with affection and longing. He wrote about the rich soil that yielded abundant crops, the forests full of game, the river teeming with fish. He wrote about the ceremonies and councils, the war dances and hunts, the sense of community and belonging that had defined Sauk life. Reading Black Hawk's words, one can feel his grief at the loss of this world, his recognition that something irreplaceable had been destroyed. The final years. Black Hawk lived out his remaining years quietly on the Iowa River, away from the great events that continued to shape the American frontier. He was present in body, but in many ways absent in spirit, a relic of a world that no longer existed. The Sauk and Fox were being pushed ever westward, confined to reservations, pressured to adopt American ways. The buffalo were disappearing from the prairies, the forests were falling to the axe, and the old way of life was fading into memory. Black Hawk died on October 3, 1838, in his lodge on the Des Moines River in Iowa. He was approximately 71 years old, though the exact date of his birth remained uncertain. He died as he had lived, among his people, still defiant in spirit even as his body failed. According to Sauk custom, Black Hawk's body was buried in a traditional manner, seated upright in a wooden enclosure with the possessions he would need in the afterlife. But even in death, Black Hawk found no peace. Within a year of his burial, grave robbers broke into his tomb and stole his skeleton. The remains eventually made their way to a museum in Burlington, Iowa, where they were put on display as a curiosity. It was a final indignity, a final violation of the man who had fought so hard to preserve the dignity and rights of his people. The skeleton was later destroyed in a fire, so Black Hawk's physical remains are scattered and lost, like the world he fought to preserve. News of Black Hawk's death spread through both Native and white communities, and he was mourned by many. Even Americans who had fought against him recognized that Black Hawk had been a man of courage and principle. Newspaper obituaries praised his bravery and his devotion to his people, even while acknowledging that his cause had been hopeless from the start. For the Sauk and other Native peoples, Black Hawk's death marked the passing of an era, the end of a generation that had known the old ways and had fought to preserve them. Legacy and remembrance. The question of Black Hawk's legacy is a complex one, tangled with the larger questions of how we remember the conflicts between Native Americans and American expansion, how we judge the actions of those who resisted and those who accommodated, how we balance empathy with historical understanding. Black Hawk has been remembered in many ways, sometimes as a tragic hero, sometimes as a misguided leader who led his people to disaster, sometimes as a symbol of Native resistance and dignity. For the Sauk and Fox peoples, Black Hawk's legacy is deeply personal. He is remembered as a man who loved his people and his homeland, who fought courageously against overwhelming odds, who refused to surrender his dignity even in defeat. His name is still spoken with respect, and his memory is preserved in the oral traditions and historical consciousness of his descendants. The Sac and Fox Nation of Oklahoma and the Sac and Fox tribe of the Mississippi and Iowa both honor Black Hawk as an important leader and a symbol of their people's resilience. For Americans, Black Hawk has become a more ambiguous figure. In the immediate aftermath of the Black Hawk War, he was often portrayed as a villain, a savage who had attacked innocent settlers and had to be defeated to secure the frontier. But as time passed, and as the brutality of the war became more apparent, sympathy for Black Hawk grew. His autobiography helped to humanize him, to show that he was not a monster, but a man fighting for his home and his people. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Black Hawk was increasingly seen as a tragic figure, a noble savage defeated by the march of progress. This romanticized view of Black Hawk, while more sympathetic than the earlier demonization, was also problematic. It tended to see Black Hawk's resistance as doomed and inevitable, a footnote to the supposedly unstoppable expansion of American civilization. It portrayed Black Hawk as dignified and brave but ultimately misguided, a leader who should have recognized that resistance was futile and should have accepted American terms. This view allowed Americans to feel sympathy for Black Hawk, while still justifying the policies that had led to his defeat. More recently, historians and Native scholars have worked to present a more nuanced and accurate picture of Black Hawk and the Black Hawk War. They have emphasized that Black Hawk's resistance was not irrational or misguided, but a reasonable response to American aggression and treaty violations. They have highlighted the fraudulent nature of the Treaty of 1804 and the justice of Black Hawk's claim that the Sauk had never legitimately ceded Saukenuk. They have also been more willing to call the Battle of Bad Axe what it was: a massacre, a deliberate slaughter of men, women, and children that violated the norms of warfare. This more critical perspective does not diminish Black Hawk's courage or his love for his people, but it places his struggle in a broader context of colonialism and dispossession. Black Hawk was not fighting against progress or civilization, but against the theft of his people's lands and the destruction of their way of life. His resistance was not futile gesture, but a principled stand for justice and sovereignty. That he was ultimately defeated does not mean he was wrong. The places associated with Black Hawk have become sites of memory and commemoration. Saukenuk itself, the village that Black Hawk loved and fought to preserve, is now largely buried under the modern city of Rock Island, Illinois. But efforts have been made to preserve what remains and to commemorate the Sauk presence. The Black Hawk State Historic Site near Rock Island includes a monument to Black Hawk and interpretive materials about Sauk history and culture. It is a place where visitors can learn about the people who lived there and the tragic events that led to their removal. Other sites associated with the Black Hawk War have also been preserved and commemorated. The battlefield at Bad Axe is now a Wisconsin State Historic Site, with markers describing the battle and its tragic outcome. Visitors to these places can walk the same ground where Black Hawk and his people fought and died, can try to imagine the fear and desperation of that terrible day, can reflect on the costs of American expansion and the suffering it caused. Black Hawk's name has been applied to many places and things across the United States. Counties, towns, parks, schools, and sports teams bear his name, a recognition of his fame, if not always of his actual history. The Chicago Blackhawks hockey team is perhaps the most famous example, though the team's use of Native American imagery has been controversial. These namings are complex gestures, sometimes honoring Black Hawk, but sometimes appropriating his name and image in ways that obscure or trivialize his actual history and struggle. In recent years, there has been growing interest in telling the story of the Black Hawk War from Native perspectives and in centering the voices and experiences of the Sauk and other Native peoples involved. Museums and historic sites are updating their interpretations to present a more balanced and accurate account of the war and its causes. Educational materials are being developed that help students understand the war not just as a military conflict, but as part of the larger history of Native American dispossession and resistance. Understanding Black Hawk in context. To truly understand Black Hawk, we need to place him in the broader context of Native American history in the 19th century. Black Hawk's story was not unique. Variations of it played out across the continent as Native peoples struggled to preserve their lands, their cultures, and their sovereignty in the face of American expansion. From the southeast to the Great Plains, from the northwest coast to the southwest, Native leaders made the same agonizing decisions that Black Hawk faced: to resist or accommodate, to fight or negotiate, to hold on to tradition or adapt to change. Some Native leaders chose accommodation, believing that survival required cooperation with the Americans. Leaders like Keokuk among the Sauk, or John Ross among the Cherokee, or Washakie among the Shoshone, worked to negotiate the best possible terms for their people, even if those terms meant surrendering lands and accepting restrictions on their sovereignty. These leaders were often vilified by more militant members of their nations, accused of selling out, of being too willing to compromise. But they saw themselves as pragmatists, doing what was necessary to ensure their people's survival. Other leaders chose resistance, believing that some things were worth fighting for even in the face of overwhelming odds. Leaders like Tecumseh among the Shawnee, or Sitting Bull among the Lakota, or Geronimo among the Apache, fought to preserve their people's lands and ways of life, rejecting American demands and resisting American encroachment. These leaders became symbols of Native resistance and dignity, but their struggles often ended in defeat and suffering for their peoples. Black Hawk fell into this second category, a leader who chose resistance over accommodation, who believed that defending his people's homeland was worth the risks involved. But his story also shows the terrible dilemmas that Native leaders faced. Black Hawk was not simply a militant or a hothead. He was a man trying to navigate an impossible situation, trying to find a way to preserve his people's way of life in a world that was determined to destroy it. His decision to return to Saukenuk in 1832 was based on faulty intelligence and false promises, but it was not irrational. He believed he could return peacefully, that the Americans could be persuaded or compelled to recognize Sauk rights, that allies would materialize to support the Sauk cause. The tragedy of Black Hawk is not that he was foolish or misguided, but that the choices available to him were all bad. Accommodation meant losing Saukenuk, losing the center of Sauk identity and culture, accepting a subordinate position in American society. Resistance meant risking everything in a conflict that the Sauk could not win. Black Hawk chose resistance because he could not bear to surrender without a fight, because he believed that some things were worth fighting for even if the fight was hopeless. Black Hawk's story also illuminates the nature of American expansion in the 19th century. The conquest of native lands was not an inevitable or natural process, but a deliberate policy choice, backed by military force, and justified by ideologies of racial superiority and manifest destiny. The Treaty of 1804, which took Sauk lands through fraud and coercion, was typical of the treaties that the United States used to acquire native territories. These treaties created a veneer of legality, a pretense that the land was being acquired through agreement rather than conquest. But the reality was that native peoples had little choice but to sign or face annihilation. The Black Hawk War was similarly typical of the conflicts that accompanied American expansion. American forces, with vastly superior numbers and firepower, pursued and destroyed a band of native people who were trying to protect their homeland. The massacre at Bad Axe, while particularly brutal, was not unique. Similar massacres occurred throughout the history of American expansion, from the slaughter of Pequots in the 17th century to the massacre at Wounded Knee in the late 19th century. What makes Black Hawk's story particularly powerful is that we have his own words, his own perspective on these events. Through his autobiography, Black Hawk speaks directly to us across the centuries, telling us what Saukenuk meant to him, why he fought, what he hoped to achieve, how he felt when he was defeated. This first-hand account humanizes Black Hawk and his people, making it impossible to see them simply as obstacles to progress or as tragic victims of historical forces beyond their control. They become real people with hopes and fears, with loves and loyalties, with agency and dignity. The broader implications. The story of Black Hawk and the Black Hawk War raises profound questions about justice, power, and historical memory. How do we judge the actions of Black Hawk and other native leaders who resisted American expansion? Were they heroes or tragic figures? Were they wise or misguided? How do we judge the actions of the Americans who took native lands and destroyed native peoples? Were they fulfilling a manifest destiny or committing injustice? Were they agents of progress or instruments of colonialism? These are not easy questions, and they do not have simple answers. But they are important questions, because how we answer them shapes how we understand American history and American identity. If we see American expansion as inevitable and beneficial, as the triumph of civilization over savagery, then Black Hawk becomes a tragic but ultimately futile obstacle to progress. But if we see American expansion as a form of colonialism, as the dispossession of indigenous peoples from their rightful lands, then Black Hawk becomes a hero, a man who fought for justice and sovereignty against overwhelming odds. The truth, as always, is more complex than either of these simple narratives. American expansion brought both benefits and costs, both progress and destruction. It created opportunities for millions of people to build new lives and new communities, but it did so at the expense of the native peoples who already lived on the land. It spread democratic ideals and economic development, but it also spread dispossession and violence. Acknowledging this complexity does not require us to be neutral or to avoid moral judgments, but it does require us to be honest about the choices that were made and the consequences they had. For the Sauk and other native peoples, the costs of American expansion were catastrophic. They lost their lands, their way of life, their sovereignty, and often their lives. The Sauk were never able to return to Saukenuk. The village was destroyed and the land was sold to settlers. The Sauk were forced onto reservations in Iowa and Kansas and eventually Oklahoma, where their descendants live today. The traditional Sauk way of life, the seasonal round of planting and hunting, the close connection to specific places and landscapes, the complex web of kinship and ceremony, all of this was disrupted and largely destroyed. But the Sauk people survived, and they continue to survive today. The Sac and Fox Nation of Oklahoma and the Sac and Fox Tribe of the Mississippi and Iowa are federally recognized tribes with their own governments, their own lands, and their own cultures. They have worked to preserve their language, their traditions, and their history, passing them on to new generations. They have adapted to changed circumstances while maintaining their identity as Sauk people. This survival, this persistence in the face of overwhelming odds, is itself a kind of victory, a testimony to the resilience and strength of Native peoples. Black Hawk's legacy is part of this larger story of Sauk survival and resistance. He is remembered not just for his military exploits or his famous war, but for his refusal to surrender his dignity and his principles even in defeat. He stood for the proposition that Native peoples had rights, that their lands and their sovereignty should be respected, that they deserved to be treated with justice and fairness. These principles were violated in Black Hawk's lifetime, and they continue to be contested today, but they remain important and valid. Reflections on a life. As we reflect on Black Hawk's life, certain themes emerge that help us understand both the man and his times. First is the theme of love of homeland. Black Hawk's attachment to Saukenuk was not simply practical or economic. It was deeply emotional and spiritual. Saukenuk was where his ancestors were buried, where his children had been born, where the sacred rituals of his people had been performed. To lose Saukenuk was to lose a part of himself, to be cut off from the sources of meaning and identity that sustained him. This profound attachment to place is something that many modern Americans can understand, even if the specific form it took in Sauk culture is foreign to us. We all have places that are important to us, places that feel like home, places that we would fight to preserve. Black Hawk's attachment to Saukenuk reminds us that Native peoples were not nomadic wanderers with no attachment to particular places, as they were sometimes portrayed in American ideology. They were deeply rooted in specific landscapes, with intricate knowledge of and connection to the places they inhabited. A second theme is the tension between tradition and change. Black Hawk was a traditionalist, deeply committed to preserving the Sauk way of life as it had been practiced for generations. But he was not simply a reactionary or a conservative. He was willing to adopt new technologies and tactics when they served his people's interests. He fought with guns as well as bows. He negotiated with Europeans and Americans. He adapted to changing circumstances. But there were limits to how far he was willing to adapt. When adaptation meant abandoning Saukenuk, abandoning the core of Sauk identity and culture, Black Hawk drew a line and refused to cross it. This tension between tradition and change is universal, but it was particularly acute for Native peoples in the 19th century, who were facing pressures to change that were more rapid and more extreme than perhaps any people had faced before. Leaders like Black Hawk had to navigate between the need to preserve traditional values and practices and the need to adapt to new realities. There were no easy answers, and different leaders made different choices, but the dilemma was one that every Native leader faced. A third theme is the importance of dignity and honor. Throughout his life, even in his worst defeats, Black Hawk maintained his dignity. He refused to be humiliated or demeaned. When he was taken prisoner and paraded before American audiences, he conducted himself with pride and composure. When he was forced to acknowledge Keokuk's authority, He did so without groveling or apologizing. This maintenance of dignity was not just personal pride. It was a way of asserting that he and his people were worthy of respect, that they had rights and sovereignty that should be recognized. This emphasis on dignity and honor was deeply rooted in Sauk culture, where a man's reputation and standing were determined by his behavior and his character. But it also speaks to something universal, to the human need to be treated with respect and fairness, to have one's humanity recognized and valued. Black Hawk's insistence on dignity, even in defeat, challenges us to recognize the humanity of all people, including those we have defeated or dispossessed. A fourth theme is the tragedy of miscalculation and misinformation. Black Hawk's decision to return to Saukenuk in 1832 was based on faulty intelligence about British support and native allies. He believed promises that turned out to be false, and he miscalculated the speed and determination of the American response. This miscalculation led to disaster, to the destruction of his band and the massacre at Bad Axe. But it is important to remember that Black Hawk was making decisions under conditions of extreme uncertainty and stress, with limited information and facing pressures that would have challenged any leader. The tragedy of the Black Hawk War is not that Black Hawk was foolish or incompetent, but that he was trapped in an impossible situation with no good options. He could either surrender without a fight and watch his people lose their homeland, or he could resist and risk everything in a conflict he could not win. He chose resistance, and he lost, but it is hard to fault him for making that choice. To surrender without a fight would have been to abandon everything he believed in, everything his people believed in, everything that made them Sauk. The end of an era. Black Hawk's death in 1838 marked the end of an era, not just for the Sauk, but for native peoples throughout the region. The generation that had known the old ways, that had lived before American domination, was passing. Their children and grandchildren would grow up in a different world, a world of reservations and government agents, of boarding schools and assimilation policies, of poverty and dispossession. The old world, the world of Saukenuk and the Rock River, the world of seasonal migrations and warfare and ceremonies, that world was gone, surviving only in memory and story. But Black Hawk's legacy endured. His autobiography continued to be read, and his story continued to be told. He became a symbol, not just of resistance, but of the broader Native American experience, of the struggle to maintain identity and dignity in the face of overwhelming forces of change and dispossession. For Native peoples, Black Hawk was a reminder that their ancestors had fought for their rights and their lands, that they had not simply accepted their fate, but had resisted with courage and determination. For Americans, Black Hawk's story was a reminder of the costs of expansion, of the suffering that had been inflicted on Native peoples in the name of progress and civilization. As Americans became more willing to acknowledge the injustices of their history, Black Hawk became an important figure in that reckoning, a person whose story helped to humanize Native peoples and to challenge the narratives that had justified their dispossession. Today, more than a century and a half after his death, Black Hawk remains a significant figure in American history. He is studied by historians, commemorated at historic sites, and remembered by his descendants and by all who care about justice and human dignity. His life story, with all its triumphs and tragedies, continues to speak to fundamental questions about power and resistance, about identity and belonging, about what we owe to each other as human beings. Conclusion: a life remembered. As we come to the end of our journey through Black Hawk's life, we are left with a complex portrait of a remarkable man. He was a warrior who fought with courage and skill in countless battles. He was a leader who inspired loyalty and devotion from his followers. He was a traditionalist who fought to preserve his people's way of life against the forces of change and destruction. He was a man who made mistakes and suffered terrible defeats, but who never lost his dignity or his commitment to his principles. Black Hawk's life unfolded during a pivotal period in American history, when the young United States was expanding across the continent and coming into conflict with the native peoples who already lived there. These conflicts were not inevitable, not natural, not the result of impersonal historical forces. They were the result of specific choices and policies, of decisions made by individuals and governments to prioritize American expansion over native rights and sovereignty. Black Hawk challenged those choices and those policies. He argued that the Sauk had never legitimately ceded their lands, that they had every right to remain in their homeland, that they deserved to be treated with justice and respect. He was ultimately defeated, and his people suffered terribly as a result, but his resistance was not meaningless or futile. It was a principled stand for justice, a refusal to surrender without a fight, an assertion that native peoples had rights and dignity that deserved to be respected. The story of Black Hawk is not a comfortable one. It confronts us with difficult questions about American history, about the costs of expansion and the suffering it caused. It challenges us to see native peoples not as obstacles to progress or as tragic victims, but as human beings with agency and dignity, with cultures and communities that had value and meaning, with rights that should have been respected. It asks us to acknowledge that American history is not simply a story of triumph and progress, but also a story of injustice and dispossession, and that this injustice has ongoing consequences for native peoples today. But Black Hawk's story is also one of resilience and survival. Despite everything that was done to them, the Sauk people survived. They maintained their identity, preserved their traditions, and passed them on to new generations. They adapted to changed circumstances while remaining Sauk. This survival, this persistence, is a testimony to the strength and resilience of native peoples, to their refusal to simply disappear or to be absorbed into the dominant culture. Black Hawk himself, even in his final years of quiet obscurity on the Iowa River, remained a symbol of this resilience. He had fought and lost, but he had not been broken. He maintained his dignity, told his story, and passed on his values to his descendants. When he died in 1838, he left behind not just memories of battles and defeats, but also a legacy of courage and principle, a model of how to face overwhelming odds with dignity and determination. As we remember Black Hawk today, we should remember him not as a savage or a villain, not as a tragic victim or a noble savage, but as a human being who lived a remarkable life during a time of profound change and conflict. We should remember his love for his people and his homeland, his courage in battle, his commitment to tradition, his refusal to surrender his dignity. We should remember the world he fought to preserve, the rich culture and way of life of the Sauk people, and we should mourn its loss even as we celebrate its survival in the lives and traditions of Black Hawk's descendants. And we should remember the larger historical context of Black Hawk's life, the policies and choices that led to the dispossession of native peoples, the suffering that was inflicted in the name of expansion and progress. Remembering Black Hawk requires us to acknowledge these uncomfortable truths about American history, to reckon with the injustices of the past and their ongoing consequences in the present. It requires us to honor not just Black Hawk himself, but all native peoples who resisted dispossession and maintained their dignity in the face of overwhelming odds. Black Hawk's story is not just history, it is a living presence that continues to speak to us today. It reminds us of the importance of standing up for justice even when the odds are against us, of maintaining our dignity and principles even in defeat, of honoring our commitments to our communities and our traditions. It reminds us that history is not made only by the powerful and the victorious, but also by those who resist and who fight for what they believe in, even when they know they will lose. Welcome. Tonight we have talked about Black Hawk, the Sauk warrior and leader who became a symbol of Native American resistance and dignity. His life spanned a crucial period in the history of North America, from the late 18th century through the first decades of the 19th century, a time when the world of Native peoples was being transformed by forces largely beyond their control. Black Hawk's response to these forces was to resist, to fight for his people and their homeland, to refuse to surrender without a struggle. He was ultimately defeated, and his people suffered terribly as a result. The world he fought to preserve was destroyed, and the Sauk were forced from their homeland into exile. But Black Hawk's legacy endures. He is remembered as a man of courage and principle, a leader who stood up for his people's rights even when the cost was high, a warrior who maintained his dignity even in defeat. His story continues to inspire and to challenge us, reminding us of the human costs of expansion and dispossession, of the importance of justice and dignity, of the resilience and survival of Native peoples despite centuries of oppression. As we close this narrative of Black Hawk's life, we carry with us not just the facts of his biography, but also the deeper lessons of his story. We carry with us an understanding of the profound love he had for his homeland, the commitment he had to his people, the courage he showed in the face of overwhelming odds. We carry with us a recognition of the injustices that were done to him and to his people, injustices that must be acknowledged and reckoned with if we are to move toward a more just future. Black Hawk's life reminds us that history is not just about dates and battles and treaties. It is about people, about their hopes and fears, their loves and loyalties, their struggles to preserve what they value in the face of forces that threaten to destroy it. It is about the choices we make, individually and collectively, and the consequences those choices have for ourselves and for others. It is about the long arc of justice and injustice, resistance and accommodation, survival and resilience. May we remember Black Hawk not just as a historical figure, but as a human being whose life has much to teach us. May we honor his memory by working toward a world where all peoples are treated with justice and dignity, where the rights of indigenous peoples are respected, where the mistakes of the past are acknowledged and addressed. May we find in his story not just sadness for what was lost, but also inspiration for what might yet be achieved if we have the courage and the commitment to stand up for what is right. The story of Black Hawk is a story of loss, but it is also a story of love of homeland, love of people, love of a way of life that gave meaning and purpose to existence. It is a story of courage in the face of overwhelming odds, of dignity maintained even in defeat, of a refusal to surrender what is most precious even when surrender seems inevitable. It is a story that belongs not just to the past, but to the present and the future. A story that continues to speak to us across the centuries, challenging us to be better, to do better, to build a world that honors the dignity and rights of all people. Tonight, we have walked with Black Hawk through the forests and along the rivers of his beloved homeland. We have witnessed his battles and his defeats, his triumphs and his tragedies. We have heard his voice through his own words speaking to us across the gulf of time, telling us what his homeland meant to him, why he fought, what he hoped to achieve. We have seen the world through his eyes, a world that was rich and meaningful, a world that was destroyed but not forgotten. As we leave Black Hawk tonight, returning to our own time and our own concerns, let us carry with us the memory of his life and the lessons of his story. Let us remember that the land we inhabit was once the homeland of other peoples, peoples who loved it as much as we do, who had every right to be here, who were dispossessed through force and fraud. Let us remember that our history is complex and troubled, marked by both achievement and injustice, and let us resolve to honor the memory of people like Black Hawk by working toward a future that acknowledges these truths and seeks to build something better. The night is quiet now, and Black Hawk's story has been told. But his spirit endures in the memories of his descendants, in the land he loved, in the ongoing struggle for justice and dignity for all peoples. May we honor that spirit by listening to his story with open hearts and open minds, by acknowledging the injustices of the past, and by committing ourselves to a more just future. Rest now, and remember Black Hawk, the Sparrow Hawk, the warrior and leader who fought for his people and his homeland, who maintained his dignity even in defeat, whose life and legacy continue to speak to fundamental questions about justice, power, and human dignity. His story is part of our shared history, a history that we must understand and reckon with if we are to build a better world for all people. Good night, and may the memory of Black Hawk inspire us to stand up for justice, to honor our commitments, to maintain our dignity in the face of adversity, and to work toward a world where all peoples are treated with the respect and fairness they deserve.